My boss cut my salary for no reason, but he never imagined what I would do before leaving. Those words still echo in my mind, not just as the beginning of a revenge story, but as the silent cry of someone who endured far more than they should have. That day didn't start any differently than any other. Cold coffee on the table, notifications piling up on the computer, and the familiar feeling that I was entering an emotional minefield. But that morning, something inside me was already different, as if I knew intuitively that something was about to break. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was destiny, or maybe it was simply the sum of months of silently swallowing frogs, months of being treated as if I were a disposable piece. When he called me into the room, his cold and calculated manner already betrayed that this wouldn't be just any conversation. He always liked to create that atmosphere of superiority, as if controlling the atmosphere of the room made him more powerful. He made sure to leave the door open, as if he wanted everyone to see that he was putting someone in their place. He sat in the large reclining chair while leaving me in a low chair, almost childlike, that made anyone seem smaller. And then, without beating around the bush, without explanations, without even looking me in the eye, he dropped the bomb. My salary would be reduced. Necessary cuts, he said, but his tone made it clear that this had absolutely nothing to do with saving money and everything to do with control. The question that hung in the air, why, was never answered. Perhaps in his mind, I didn't even deserve that. The mixture of frustration, injustice, and helplessness that overwhelmed me at that moment cannot be described in just one word. It's as if all the times I tried to be understanding, all the nights I stayed up late to deliver projects, all the times I swallowed veiled insults, it had all accumulated into a heavy mass that went down my throat and tightened my chest. That decision wasn't just professional. It was personal. It was a clear attempt to diminish me, to silence me, to make me believe that I depended on him to survive. And perhaps for a long time I really did believe that. As he spoke, gesturing like a great master explaining a lesson to an ignorant apprentice, something inside me began to disconnect. His words reached my ears like a distant buzz, while my thoughts wandered far away. I looked at that arrogant figure in front of me and thought, how long have I let this happen? How long have I allowed someone to treat me this way? It was as if, for the first time, I was seeing everything without a filter, and the truth was painful. I had become accustomed to the abuse. It had become routine. Maybe you've been through this before. Maybe you've also felt that someone at work wanted to belittle you just to feel powerful. Maybe you've felt the weight of a gaze that doesn't see you as a person, but as an object. Maybe you've realized that no matter how hard you try, some people don't want you to grow, because your growth threatens the small empire of control they try to maintain. It's a kind of silent pain that many people carry, but few talk about. And that day, I understood that I wasn't alone in this. When the conversation ended, he dismissed me like someone telling an employee to clear the lunch table. No thank you, no proper explanation, not even the awareness of the impact of the decision, just a curt gesture. With his hand, I returned to my desk with my mind ablaze. The injustice boiled inside me, and each step seemed heavier than the last, as if my feet were bound by invisible chains. I sat down at the computer, took a deep breath, and began to look around. The office seemed the same. The desks lined up, the noisy keyboard of the colleague next to me, the printer complaining in the copy room, but everything seemed clearer, crueler, more real. It was as if a veil had been lifted from my eyes. And then, in the midst of that whirlwind, the trigger of curiosity appeared. It wasn't planned, it wasn't premeditated. It was almost an instinct. His computer was unlocked. The screen was lit. The chair was empty. The opportunity perfect. And before I could even rationalize what I was about to do, a phrase exploded inside me. But what I discovered on his computer changed everything. I had no idea at that moment that that simple click would open the door to a secret he never imagined anyone could find. A secret that not only explained his toxic behavior, but revealed something much bigger, much dirtier, much more dangerous, something that would affect not only my life, but his entire career. And there, in that silent moment, In the middle of an office that feigned normalcy, my story truly began. If there's one thing I learned working with him, it's that not all toxicity is explicit. Some are silent, calculated, almost invisible, but they corrode from within like hidden rust. To an outsider, he seemed merely severe, someone who demanded results. But those who were close to him knew something was profoundly wrong. The problem wasn't demanding it. It was the pleasure of controlling. It was the power imbalance used as a weapon. It was his ability to twist reality until you doubted your own worth. It started with small delays in payment. At first, he would smile and say it was an internal process, a system failure, something from the finance department. That smile was fake, artificial, as if to say, "Bear with it, you depend on me." Over time, I realized that the delays didn't happen to everyone, only to those he wanted to keep in line. It was a silent psychological game, and I was one of his favorite pieces. Sometimes he would withhold my payment for weeks, and when I asked, he made it seem like I was being inconvenient, ungrateful, dramatic. That was one of his strategies, to make the victim feel ashamed for demanding the bare minimum. The veiled threats came soon after. He never said it directly. He hinted. He often used phrases like, "I hope you're committed because a lot of people want your job," or, "I don't want to have to reconsider certain positions if you can't keep up with my pace." The goal was clear, to create enough insecurity so that I would never feel comfortable, so that I would never feel too secure, so that I would believe that my future depended exclusively on his mood and how much I was willing to tolerate. Favoritism was another sharp weapon he wielded masterfully. It wasn't simply a preference for someone more competent. It was a system of rewards and punishments that he manipulated like a maestro of chaos. He always had one or two chosen ones, whom he treated well, praised publicly, and invited to lunch. These people were used to create division, competition, and jealousy within the team. He fueled tensions to weaken bonds and prevent employees from uniting against him. The more isolated we were, the more we depended on his approval. It was perverse and efficient. But the worst part was the emotional abuse. He knew exactly where each person was most vulnerable. He knew who was afraid of losing their job, who desperately needed the salary, who had difficulties at home, who had low self-esteem. It was as if he studied everyone calmly, identifying emotional weaknesses to exploit. Sometimes he made comments that seemed innocent, but carried poison behind them. He would say that someone didn't have the leadership profile, that another wasn't up to the challenge, that another needed to mature. And of course, these phrases were never said directly. He spoke looking at me, as if the message had a specific target. Over time, I realized I had been recording everything almost reflexively. Strange messages, out-of-the-blue emails, contradictory orders, mismatched documents, tense conversations. I kept everything, and it wasn't out of revenge. It was for protection. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was survival. Maybe, deep down, I knew that one day I would need this evidence. But at the moment, it seemed just a way to maintain my sanity, a way to remind myself that I wasn't making anything up, that it really happened, that I wasn't crazy. With each new situation, with each new act of disrespect, I began to realize that the problem wasn't just with me. It was his pattern, the way he enjoyed belittling people, the look of satisfaction that appeared on his face when someone left the meeting room with red eyes, the way he leaned back in his chair when he saw someone was upset. He fed off of it. It was a dark, exhausting energy that hung in the air like a cheap perfume you can't ignore. The audience needs to think, this could happen to me. And the truth is, it could, because this type of boss doesn't present himself as a villain. He presents himself as a leader, as a mentor, as someone demanding, but fair. He hides behind false reports, goals, and motivational speeches, and that's exactly what makes people like him so dangerous. You only realize you're being manipulated when you're already too emotionally exhausted to react. But what was most unsettling was a constant, almost physical feeling that accompanied me every day. The feeling that there was something bigger behind it. As if all that toxicity wasn't just a personality trait, but a symptom of a well-kept secret. a fear he tried to mask by humiliating others, a deep insecurity that made him act so aggressively. Every time he showed his toxic side, I realized there was something even bigger behind it, something that didn't make sense at first, but that would become clear the moment I opened that hidden folder on his computer. And that realization, that tiny spark of doubt, would be exactly what would transform my life and destroy his career. The scene from that day is etched in my memory as if filmed in slow motion. I was focused, trying to finish an urgent task, when I felt his presence standing behind my chair. He didn't say, "Good morning," didn't ask if I was busy, much less bang on the table. He simply crossed his arms and said in a dry voice, "I need to talk to you, now." There was no real urgency in his speech, just a desire to show authority. He liked this kind of theatrical entrance, this psychological game where every move he made had to reinforce that he was at the top of the pyramid and we were down there, waiting for crumbs of approval. The walk to his office felt like a courtroom corridor. I remember seeing colleagues discreetly glancing like someone witnessing an impending accident, but avoiding direct contact for fear of getting involved. The office door closed behind me with that irritating click that always seemed louder than it should be. He sat slowly in the armchair, leaning forward in a calculated way, as if he were about to give a lecture on corporate responsibility. But his gaze betrayed pleasure. A strange, cold pleasure, like someone who knows he's going to get something out of you and is eager to see your reaction. "We need to talk about your performance," he began, shuffling through some papers that clearly had nothing to do with me. He loved this charade, pretending to review important documents when, in reality, everything had already been decided before I even walked in. He talked about necessary adjustments, about internal restructuring, about strategic cuts, but his words were empty, recycled, the same excuse he'd used with other employees in the past, whenever he wanted to test someone's limits. And then came the phrase I'll never forget: "Your salary will be adjusted downward." He said it with such absurd nonchalance that for a moment I thought I'd misheard. Adjusted downwards? Without warning? Without justification? Without any plausible reason? He continued speaking as if he were discussing the day's weather. I remember my fingers going cold and my heart racing uncomfortably. I tried to ask why. He replied with the utmost calm, "Board decision." But we both knew that was a lie. He was the board. He always had been, and worse. He made a point of making that clear, even when he pretended otherwise. The revolt began to grow like a wildfire inside, because it was impossible to ignore the hypocrisy. He reduced my salary, but kept his intact, even while embezzling money from the company. And that wasn't just suspicion. It was fact. I had already seen strange movements. I had already heard conversations at odd hours. I had already seen documents that didn't add up. But until that day, I hadn't allowed myself to believe the extent of the dirt. It was hard to imagine someone so arrogant also being so corrupt. But there, looking at him with that cynical smile, I realized that all that abusive behavior was rooted in something much more rotten. When I left the room, I felt as if an entire layer of illusion had been ripped from my face. The truth was exposed, naked, raw. Hard work doesn't protect anyone from a toxic boss. There I realized with painful clarity that dedication is no shield against malice, that professionalism doesn't overcome manipulation, that effort doesn't prevent injustice, and that in the end those who have no limits end up being crushed by those who abuse their position. The feeling was an intense mix of humiliation, anger, and a strange freedom that was beginning to emerge, as if something inside me had awakened after months of slumber. I sat at my desk trying to breathe deeply, watching the office routine continue as if nothing had happened. The machines printed, people typed, the phones rang. But inside me, something had changed, something had broken, and at the same time, something had finally aligned. As I stared at my computer screen, the thought came as a whisper, then as a shout. This can't stay like this. It was perhaps the most decisive moment of my life. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted to bring him down, but because I wanted the truth. I needed the truth. I needed to understand where that cruelty came from, that arrogant self-assurance, that way of acting that crossed any ethical line. And it was in that state, a mixture of exhaustion and lucidity, that my eyes turned to something I had never noticed before. A small, almost hidden icon in a folder I didn't remember seeing. A generic name, unremarkable, but which seemed out of place. A tiny detail, but one that, at that moment, flashed like a light bulb in the dark. It was on that day that I decided to open the file that would change his life. I didn't know what I would find inside. I didn't know if it was something serious or just a coincidence. But instinct, that same instinct that had been with me for months, told me, Abra, and that click, that simple movement of his finger, would be the trigger that would bring down the castle of lies he had built for years. The last straw wasn't just the pay cut. It was realizing he believed I wouldn't do anything, that I would lower my head like everyone else, that I would accept it silently. But he underestimated one thing. When someone pushes you to the bottom of the well, sometimes that's where you find the strength you never knew you had. When I returned to my desk after the fateful meeting, I still tasted the bitter flavor of humiliation. But that little icon, that folder with the generic name, seemed to call to me. It was as if everything around me had, fallen silent, waiting for me to make the decision that would change the course of history. I had suspected something was wrong for a long time, but I had never had the courage to go all the way. That day, however, after he cut my salary as if I were disposable, something inside me broke, and at the same time was set free. The opportunity arose almost ironically. His computer was across the hall, in a glass-walled room he loved, because it allowed him to observe everyone from above, like a guard, watching over prisoners. But he had a dangerous habit. He forgot to lock his computer when he left for his endless meetings. And that day, as if it were part of a script written by fate, he left in a hurry, talking on the phone, slamming the door shut, and left everything open. Everything. Login saved, files accessible, folders minimized. It was as if the universe had looked at me and said, "Now." My heart was pounding so fast I could feel it throbbing in my throat. I looked around to make sure no one was watching. The room was empty. I took a deep breath and went in. The computer was there, glowing on the home screen, almost taunting me. I sat in his chair, and it was strange. It was like invading the throne of someone who considered himself untouchable. I could almost hear his voice saying that this was a rule violation, as if he himself were a model of conduct. The irony gave me strength. I moved the mouse. The screen lit up, and there it was. That folder, hidden, but not invisible. Concealed but not inaccessible, placed inside another folder with a common name, the kind of trick someone uses when they want to hide something but don't know how to encrypt it. The name was simple, almost silly, old spreadsheets, but I knew. I knew there was nothing there that was old or innocent. I clicked, the folder opened, and it was like opening the door to a basement full of dirty secrets. What I saw there wasn't just irregular, it wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. There were spreadsheets with financial transactions that didn't make sense, amounts transferred between accounts without justification, phantom payments issued to companies that, upon quick browser searches, simply didn't exist. There were manipulated documents, forged contracts, digitally copied and pasted signatures. He wasn't just embezzling money, he was building an entire scheme behind the scenes, a labyrinth designed to deceive any superficial audit. But it didn't stop there. In another subfolder, I found private messages, conversations with suppliers and service providers where he negotiated personal advantages, bribes, and under-the-table deals. There were screenshots of conversations in which he humiliated employees, orchestrated dismissals, and devised strategies to pressure vulnerable people into accepting worse conditions. His cruelty wasn't just a personality trait, it was a work tool. He used fear as fuel to keep everything running. And then, the final blow, archived. Emails where he treated his own company as if it were a personal wallet. Transfers, fake invoices, embezzlement disguised as strategic bonuses, advance payments to offshore accounts. It was so dirty that anyone who looked at it for 5 minutes would be absolutely certain that he had been committing crimes for years. I felt a weight in my stomach. It wasn't just anger anymore. It wasn't about the salary cut. It wasn't about humiliation. It was about justice. It was so serious that I knew I couldn't just walk away. That phrase echoed in my mind as I went through each file. I knew that if I closed the screen and pretended not to have seen anything, I would become complicit. And I couldn't live with that. Not after everything he had done. Not after so many had been hurt by his hands. I needed to do something, but do it the right way, without explosions, without hasty scandals, without giving him room to manipulate the situation, as he always did. That's when a plan began to take shape, clear, cold, surgical. I discreetly plugged in my flash drive. I copied everything, every spreadsheet, every email, every altered document, every incriminating conversation. I organized the evidence into separate folders, named objectively as if they were part of a professional report. Frauds, document handling, deviations, compromising messages, evidence. My heart was pounding, but my hands were strangely steady. It was as if I had trained for that moment without realizing it. But I didn't stop there. I opened a blank document and wrote a detailed, point-by-point report describing everything I had found. No exaggeration. No emotion, just facts. I printed the lines clearly, with the precision of someone who had seen that behavior for too long to doubt it. I added screenshots, attached files, cited dates, times, and specific transactions. I assembled a complete dossier professional, irrefutable. And finally, I prepared the final blow, an email scheduled to be sent. Automatically the following day, addressed to the board of directors, finance, legal, and HR. The text was simple, direct, and devastating. The kind of message that couldn't be ignored. The kind of expose that blows open the meeting room door and paralyzes any attempt at a cover-up. Before leaving his office, I placed the dossier in a folder on my desktop, labeled for urgent review. It was ironic, almost poetic, as if it were something he himself had left there. He always said that the truth always comes out when he wanted to accuse someone unjustly. This time it did, only against him. I left the room with my heart racing, but with a profound sense that something important had been done. He still had no idea. He was still on top, believing that no one would ever dare to challenge him. But everything was already in motion, and the next day, his career was over. When the bomb exploded, no one in the company could pretend they hadn't seen it. Management called for an urgent internal audit. The legal department showed up that same morning, and his name, the one who had humiliated me for months, became the focus of a serious investigation. Hours later, the news was circulating through the hallways. He had been officially dismissed. In less than a week, the final blow came. Dismissal for just cause and an open process to investigate all the crimes committed. And me? For the first time in a long time, I took a deep breath and felt peace, a true peace, as if years of abuse, humiliation, manipulation, and threats had finally fallen from my shoulders. I didn't need to take revenge with screams or hatred. The truth did it for me, and the moral is simple. When someone tries to destroy you, when someone uses their authority to crush you, sometimes that person is unknowingly digging their own grave. And when the mask falls, it's not you who loses, it's him. This chapter of my life wasn't just about justice. It was about resilience, inner strength, and the courage to not remain silent when everything within you wants to give up. If this story captivated you, leave a like because it really helps the channel. And comment below, have you ever had a toxic boss in your life? I want to read every story.